Greetings, Bermuda. My name is Aaron Hill, and I'm joined by my brother and good friend, Mr. Ryan Robinson, Perinchief, and together we are the host of the Bernews special COVID-19 series. Before we begin today, we'd like to take this opportunity to express our sincere condolences to the families of the 5 Bermudians who've tragically lost their lives as a result of COVID-19. We'd also like to take this time to extend our sincere best wishes to those who are currently suffering with the COVID-19 virus. We also believe it appropriate to give a special shout out and thanks to our essential workers who are on the front lines defending us from this virus. Before we get into the exact dialogue, we'd like to give thanks to Bernews for affording us this platform and this opportunity to engage with you, the members of the public, as we discuss what the effects of and our response to the COVID-19 pandemic will be for us in Bermuda. We're resilient people. Bermudians are extremely resilient. We will recover and we will respond. Part of that recovery and response is having part of the dialogue that we plan to engage here today. Having said that, I'll pass it along to Ryan so that he can tell you a bit more of the topics that we intend to discuss and the rationale and why we thought it prudent to have this show.
Thank you, Aaron. In the past 2 months, we've seen the COVID-19 novel coronavirus take the world by storm. We've seen approximately 2.6 million cases and nearly 200,000 deaths. The World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern on the 30th of January 2020 and recognized it officially as a pandemic on the 11th of March. Here in Bermuda, we've seen 99 confirmed cases and sadly 5 deaths, the families of which we extend our sincerest condolences. We're now in a state of emergency with government having implemented the shelter-in-place regulations. Whilst the Premier and members of the public have called for unity, and certainly this is a storm that we all must weather together, the nature of our state of emergency, our shelter-in-place, the constitutional rights being suspended, and having our economy in tatters means that now more than ever, Bermuda needs critical and community-centered discussion around this crisis, how we deal with it, and how we move forward. So again, we're grateful to Bernews for granting us this platform. We hope that you, the public, will find this to be a valuable resource as we navigate this crisis together. Over the next few weeks, on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2 p.m., Aaron and I will be engaging in critical conversation and dialogue, and perhaps some debate, Aaron, around some of the hot topics that our people are thinking about as we navigate this emergency. We hope to particularly address everything ranging from the constitutional implications and legal implications of the state of emergency and the shelter-in-place regulations, to food security, to the economy, and to other economic and other considerations as we deal with this crisis together. So with that being said, I think for today's show, we're going to talk a little bit about government's response so far, sort of how we got here, what people are thinking at present. We're also going to hear, most importantly, from you, the people. So throughout the next few shows, we'll be bringing on some experts and debating some other issues and topics. But for now, I'll turn it over to you, Aaron, to talk a little bit about what we're doing so far and bring on some guests that we have today as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ryan. We appreciate that. I think that it is conceded or acknowledged rather that these are unprecedented times around the globe. Specifically here in Bermuda, we're facing unprecedented times. Right now, we're all confined to our homes, save for essential workers and having, permission to go to the grocery shop on certain days. And so we've seen education having to be versatile. We've seen jobs that otherwise would be their hospitality or tourism industry that's going to be seriously affected. And so there are a tremendous amount of topics that we intend to discuss during the course of the next few weeks as we look at how Bermuda is going to respond on a holistic level. Today, I know that we have 2 guests, Mr. Stratton Hatfield and Ms. Ciara Burrows. I know that Ms. Burrows is a law student, like us, Ryan, studying in the United Kingdom, and Mr. Stratton Hatfield, who wears many hats. So we're going to let him decide which hat he wants to describe himself and let him tell us a bit about himself today. Having said that, we'd like to bring on Mr. Hatfield, who's waiting backstage.
So as Aaron and I had stated, this is a community forum, which means that although Aaron and I are going to have our little debates as lawyers and law students and young Bermudians, we'd also like to hear from you, the public. We will be guided by your discussions. And even as we post this show, we'd like to hear your feedback. So having said that, welcome, Stratton. Is everything okay? Can you hear us fine?
Yes, I can. Greetings, guys. How are you?
Everything's good with us.
Good.
Thank you for coming on and being a guest on today's show. As we stated, we'd like to get a range of members of the community to give their input. Certainly, the government is doing their job, and the healthcare and the essential workers are doing their job. But it's also our job as the public to not only support their efforts, but also to critique and comment and engage in productive conversation, right? So with that being said, we'd have a few questions we'd like to ask you and get your thoughts on this current scenario. Can you tell us a bit first, Stratton, I know you're a Chevening scholar. You've done a couple of other projects in the community. Tell us a bit about your background and what you're doing currently.
Yeah, so I'm a young Bermudian entrepreneur and activist, and I've been involved with a variety of different organizations on the island. Currently, I'm responsible for business development at BE Solar, helping them grow the business in renewable energy in Bermuda. But I'm also the co-founder and director of an online polling website called WeCount.bm, and that's something that I certainly have been putting more time to recently. But I'm currently working from home and based in my house in Paget right now.
Now, Stratton, I saw you mentioned WeCount briefly. I saw some ads on Facebook. Is it a polling website or what are you doing? I saw some things there about COVID-19 specifically.
Yeah, so WeCount.bm is Bermuda's first authenticated polling website. It's designed to empower the people of Bermuda to learn about topics, to vote on those topics, and then to see the data and the results in real time. Our intention is for this to be a community platform for people to source data so that they can use it to lobby for change, whatever sort of change they're looking to lobby for in Bermuda.
Okay, sounds good. So just as you're gauging people's opinions on topics, we want to pick your brain a little bit today, if that's good with you. So yeah. What are your thoughts on the current situation?
Yeah, so I would say it's mixed emotions these days. I've definitely been going through periods of sadness and worrying about the state of Bermuda and thinking about people's livelihoods and, having some fears around that, to be honest. I also am an optimist and trying to look for the silver linings and some of the opportunities that might emerge out of this. So I would say my feelings are kind of mixed, but ultimately I'm trying to remain optimistic about what we can do post COVID-19.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're all a bit worried and a bit anxious. But one of the important things to do is things like what we're doing now, right? Which is not only talking and acknowledging that, but also trying to have a bit more forward thinking.
Certainly.
So having said that, do you have any thoughts particularly on the Bermuda government's response? I know we've seen around the world, there's been a lot of debate and controversy as countries and governments are navigating this crisis. How do you think Bermuda government's doing?
Yeah, considering that this is unprecedented and there's no guidebook to this, I think the Bermuda government has done a fantastic job at responding to this and prioritizing keeping our community safe. I think that they have demonstrated some bold leadership as to how we can work through this. I think that there's going to be a lot more detail in terms of what Bermuda looks like post-COVID and how we can really prepare for getting Bermuda back to work and in improving the livelihoods of the community, especially the vulnerable parts of our community that are going to be suffering the most after this pandemic ends.
Mm-hmm. What types of things are you looking forward to expecting from the future?
One of the things that I can't help but think about is how Bermuda responds post-hurricanes. I think we see a really strong sense of community and collaboration that comes after a hurricane. And one of the things that I really hope we can work towards in Bermuda is enhancing our collaboration and working together to really come out of this and improve Bermuda. If there's any sort of lightness that's going to come out of this darkness, I think collaboration is going to be one of the key elements to that. And that's certainly something that I'm looking forward to seeing our community come together with more.
Okay. Now, Stratton, you did mention that you do WeCount and you work at BE Solar and you do some other things. But I also saw something from you related to food security. So, you did mention some sorts of things that you're looking forward to seeing in the future. But I also know you're a sustainability guy. Tell us a bit about what you think about that.
Yeah, so just to give some clarity, I completed a master's degree last year on sustainability, entrepreneurship, and design. One of my modules was related to planetary health and climate change. And in that module, I did research around Bermuda's food security. And, it's obvious that it's something that we really need to start focusing on more now, is how can we become more resilient when it comes to food security, and ensuring that we're not only producing and growing more food locally, but how are we ensuring that people have access to good, high quality, nutritional food? That's something that's very important. Definitely one of the things I want to be focusing on.
Do you think that that's something the government should be factoring in its COVID-19 response, or is it a bit too early?
I think it's a bit too early now. I think we also need to be a little weary of relying too much on government. Government can only supply and support us to a certain extent. And, we're already in a lot of debt. So the thought of us relying on government more is quite daunting. I think it's going to be, once again, a combination of private and public sectors collaborating in order to enhance food security in Bermuda. And all hands on deck, get out there and start growing your own food in your garden to begin with. You don't need government support for that.
I was just going to ask, what sorts of things do you think we as a people need to be doing right now? I mean, obviously we're in a shelter in place situation right now, but, I guess looking forward to the future, are these things that are sort of urgent to act on now, or?
Certainly, without a doubt. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to really be focusing on resilience measures and what we can do in our own backyards and in our own houses in order to really develop and enhance that resilience. But something as simple as putting some seedlings in the ground and starting your vegetables is a good first start, I would say. And quite simple. We're blessed in Bermuda to have the climate and the weather to be able to do this.
Okay. Well, Stratton, thank you for that and sharing your thoughts so far. Before you go, I just want to get an idea. What types of topics would you like to see us, Aaron and I, discuss on the special COVID-19 series?
I applaud both of you men for focusing on this and really enhancing this dialogue. There's two things that I really would like to see you guys focusing on discussing with the community. For years we've been using GDP to measure growth in Bermuda. Gross domestic product does not accurately reflect the health and well-being of our community. So how can we use this opportunity to shift towards measuring health and well-being? How can we look towards incorporating an index to really measure how we're improving the social and environmental development of our community? So think a gross national well-being index, perhaps something to really monitor and measure how are we helping improve the social fabric of Bermuda, and both looking at our social environment and our natural environment.
So do you think we're focusing a bit too much on economics? Is that sort of what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to focus on the economics because that's what helps support our livelihoods. But I also think that it's really important for us to look towards measuring our health and our well-being, both as individuals and as people, but also as the places that we're occupying and living within. Bhutan is one of the countries that has a gross happiness index. Could Bermuda be incorporating our own well-being index to say this is how we're improving our well-being in our community, and how can we really come out of this with that being a measurement tool for government and for the private sector to use to say, we're actually enhancing and improving some of the social injustices that exist in our island and in our community.
Now, I can get with that, and I think there's quite a few Bermudians who may agree with that. But at the same time, Stratton, right now, in the midst of this crisis, thousands have lost their jobs. Government has increased the debt ceiling. What would you say to a Bermudian out there who says, happiness is great and all of that, but as for right now, people are just trying to survive. We really need to be focusing on the money.
You know what? I wouldn't say it's centered around just happiness. Happiness is very subjective and it obviously ebbs and flows with individuals. I think it really goes back to health and well-being. Health and well-being is something that should be prioritized over economics right now. Because if you're not healthy and you don't have a good well-being, how are you supposed to go to work? How are you supposed to generate any income if you don't even have a good health standard or you don't even feel well? So I'm not going to deny that we need to focus on economic growth right now, but I also think that it's important for us to discuss how can we develop an index to really enhance health and well-being in Bermuda and really monitor that. Bermuda government was doing that at a certain point under the Sustainable Development Department. They were monitoring this up until 2015, and it ended then. But we have the opportunity to do that, and there's lots of models that are going on around the world that are doing that. The Thriving Places Index is a really interesting one in the UK, for example. So that's one of the topics. The other topic that I really would like to see you guys explore is the concept of resilience. And what does resilience really look like for Bermuda? How can we become more resilient and less reliant on external forces in order to sustain our own community? When I talk about resilience, I'm thinking about things like food security, I'm thinking about energy security, and I'm thinking about job security. You know, how can we improve the resilience of our community in those sort of elements? And that's certainly something I think you guys could agree with as well, is that we need to be less reliant on external forces in order to really come out of this stronger.
It sounds like we need to bring you back on for another debate, Stratton. The first point, you know, what you mentioned about, it really makes me think of the wider debate. You know, we've seen, for example, this play out, for example, the United States right now, where the country is a bit divided, right? Because some people are saying we need to get everybody back to work, we need to focus on the economy, and others are saying, you know, the health and the well-being has to come first. And I know in Bermuda, Premier Bird has said, you know, the life is more important, and so we're going to shut down until we feel it's comfortable, until we feel we're safe to open back up. So I think your point there, it's a valid point, and it extends into a wider conversation. As far as the second thing you've said about resilience, you know, I'm all about sustainable development and self-sufficiency. So I definitely think that that's a very good topic for us to discuss. So thank you, Stratton, for giving us your time so far. It's been great to sort of pick your brain a bit. I know that you're somebody who wears many hats, from recount to PE solar to sustainable development, and we look forward to possibly having you back on to discuss some of those topics. What do you think, Aaron?
No, absolutely. We appreciate your contribution, and thank you. I know that you've got to go now, but we do appreciate your contribution, and thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you so much, you guys. I really applaud your leadership, and you know, the future is bright seeing your young minds involved with all of this. And I think it's going to take all hands on deck to really focus on how we can improve Bermuda. And I applaud you for doing this. And thank you to Bernews for providing you with this platform to really elevate this discussion. So I look forward to continuing this, and good luck with getting more people on board to talk with you guys.
Great. Thanks, Stratton, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you so much, guys. Take care.
So, Aaron, I don't know if you caught the last part, but I thought it was interesting about what Stratton was saying. I asked him sort of what topics he'd like to see us discuss. And, you know, a lot of times as we think about moving forward out of this crisis, we're talking about the things that are immediate concerns, right? So things like food and work and jobs and the economy and health. But Stratton mentioned something that was a bit more theoretical, and he said he'd like us to talk a bit about resilience and what it means to be resilient. For him, he said that, you know, resilience to him meant things like being able to sustain ourselves and find our own strength. And I think that's really important and something we have to talk about as we examine the other questions we asked him, things like how the government is handling this, how the people are handling this, and what we're looking forward to seeing in the future.
No, absolutely, Ryan. I think it kind of features into what we were talking about before personally, about our generation and how we actually are dealing with this thing a bit differently than some of the older generation who have been through things in the past that caused them to be united, and how for a younger generation, this is causing us to ask the question, do we have a collective identity as a people? Because now more than ever before, we've had to come together. We're all in this same situation. We're all in the same boat, whether you're in Bermuda, the United States, or as our next guest is going to be in the United Kingdom. We're all facing similar conditions. So absolutely, times like this do call for resilience, and it is going to be a test of whether or not our generation will stand up to that call and become more resilient to deal not only with this challenge, but challenges that will come in the future.
I'm glad you mentioned the generational aspect, right? Because I was scrolling on Facebook this morning and I saw a picture of one of the banks. The line this morning is going around the corner, and most of the people in those lines were seniors, right? Because they don't use direct deposit online. A lot of them, you know, a lot of them are not familiar with the technology. You know, when I need to send somebody else some money, I just go on my phone and open up an app. And, you know, my life right now is not as interrupted as somebody who, for example, has to go grocery shopping on a regular, needs to go into the bank and wait in line to make a transfer, and relies on things like in-person meetings as opposed to being familiar with technology, right? So when they're talking about resilience and adaptability, I think particularly with the younger generation, overall, I think Bermuda, and I have to credit the Bermudian people, we have adapted, I think, pretty well to this so far. But I also, on the other end, I have to wonder, could that be a bad thing? Is it possible to be too adaptable? Where we get in a situation where we're too comfortable, this is at the end of the day a state of emergency, right? And a lot of this stuff is supposed to be temporary. So I think we have to have a wider conversation about getting too comfortable, switching into this particular scenario. What do you think?
No, absolutely. And I think we're going to come to analyze that when we have on some of our legal experts, when they talk about whether or not some of the actions that have been taken fall foul of the Constitution, or whether things are premature or the like. Because like you say about adaptability, yes, there's a crisis. Yes, there is a state of emergency, but still there is a Constitution in place and there are checks and balances that need to be had. So notwithstanding the fact that you have an issue, you have a pandemic, you have any sort of state of emergency that may arise in the future, you do still have checks and balances from a legal point of view. And certainly they will be able to speak to it to ask whether or not we're not just moving, we're not just adapting with the times, but we recognize that we do have these confines that we define as the law that we've got to stick between. So yes, we need adaptability, but in some sense you need the stability and recognizing that there is some confines that we've got to.
And not just from a legal perspective, right, but also as a culture. I stopped by to check on one of my family members the other day, and I said, how are you coping? And she said, well, Ryan, I know you're fine. You're probably sitting at home. For those who don't know, I'm a law student. So prior to this pandemic, I was in the UK studying in Birmingham. And I actually came home because of the pandemic, and all my classes have been moved online and things like that. So I've been getting up early, adapting, right, at 5 a.m. to do my virtual classes. And my auntie was like, you'll be fine. You're used to this technology stuff and these computers. And I said, actually, I don't like it. I'm a very social person. I prefer to be around people physically in that space. So for me, I don't really enjoy having to do things online and all the virtual calls. It's convenient, and we've adapted to it, but it's not something that I'm particularly comfortable with. So even as I sit and complain about all the seniors standing in line, right, who haven't switched to online banking, I also have to think about the implications on our culture. Bermudians are fundamentally an outside people. Some of us are going crazy stuck inside our houses right now because we're used to getting on our bikes and running around and running errands all day. So we have to think also, we need to be adaptable, but at the same time, how do we navigate this in a way where it doesn't dramatically interrupt our way of life in a permanent basis?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Having said that, and on that note, I think we want to queue up our next guest, Ms. Ciara Burrows, who is a law student studying in Southampton in the United Kingdom. Ciara, welcome.
Hi, guys. Thank you for having me. I'm great, thanks.
So I know that you've been in the backstage waiting for a bit, tuned in. You heard Stratton Hatfield, you heard him speak, you heard him what he had to say, particularly with respect to adaptability. Do you have any comments before we get on to you introducing yourself and asking you some questions? Do you have anything to say in response?
I was mostly backstage, not in my head, to be honest. As far as food security, just in terms of robust systems in place that we need to have as a community, as a country, to make sure that we can survive this pandemic without relying too heavily on external support. And I think that he's right in terms of the community solidarity that we've already seen to date, as far as staying home and making sure that we fight this pandemic together. Most of his thoughts I would echo in support of, yeah.
Thank you. So we didn't stop there. We hit the road running right into a response. But if you could just let everybody know who you are, what you've been doing. You're out there in the UK studying law. Tell us a bit about yourself.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ciara Burrows. As Ryan and Aaron have already pointed out, I'm studying law at the University of Southampton out here in the UK. And I've been here doing an accelerated bachelor's of law since October. So haven't been out here very long, but just getting used to the UK studying law, and I guess as everybody else has experienced in the last month, things have changed rapidly. And as Brian was saying before, my classes have all moved online now, and so I'm getting used to working from home, studying from home, still in contact with my family and friends every day, just trying to adapt and get used to this new transitory period. I wouldn't say new normal, because I think we'll come on to that a bit later in terms of what's normal and how we can kind of move forward.
If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you on that now. You know, we've heard some government ministers mention this is the new normal for now. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's very interesting, the rhetoric that's going on in terms of how we're coping with this period. Do we view it as the new normal? Do we view it as this is just the bridge until we figure out what we're going to do next, or this is just how we're going to live until we return to the old normal? And I think that depending on who you are, that's a really big question. And for me, I think that it's important not to say that that we need to get back to our normal, because I don't think that normal was the best situation that we could have been in the first place. I think some of our earlier discussions, on a personal note, even with all of this uncertainty and anxiety that we're facing as a country and as a global population, I think uncertainty creates opportunities like this time that we have right now to reflect on what we considered normal. Stratton talked a little bit about how we measure happiness and how we measure just the kind of what we use as indicators for the economy, and maybe taking a step back and looking at, well, how can we improve that? How can we expand the way that we view the most important things in a society, whether that's health or happiness? And I think that for me, studying law, but also looking at the insurance side of it, uncertainty always creates opportunities for reflection, but then also growth. Looking back at how we've dealt with past adversity, similar issues, not as wide as this pandemic, but how can we grow and evolve as a people when it comes to things like the economy, education, and health security?
No, sure. I don't know if you saw earlier, but I was cut off for a bit on it, and I was having trouble connecting back to the internet. And it reminded me of a comment that you made on the initial post when we were advertising. And the question was, is access to internet a fundamental right? And in times like this, where you have, constitutional rights being suspended in light of a state of emergency, you do have those legal scholars out there who are pontificating questions such as that. To what extent can governments, not just here in Bermuda, but across the globe, restrict freedoms? And that's the question. What are your particular thoughts on whether or not, in that confined aspect, whether internet is a fundamental right? Particularly when you juxtapose that with the notion what we've just said is this the new normal?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and topic, something that I've personally been thinking about myself, because before this pandemic, that was an actual question that we had to toss around in law school to kind of just discuss, should we have access to the internet? And at the time, pre-COVID-19, it seemed like a very privileged first world problem. We have to have access to the internet because people, do things like banking online, make certain payments, insurance, pay phone bills. A lot of not only social interactions, but financial transactions are made online in the 21st century. And so, in the face of this pandemic, where we're literally, sheltering in place, and we're not able to go to financial institutions per se, with the exception of, as you were saying, Ryan, some seniors are still going to do their banking and get the essentials like groceries and things like that nature. It really begs the question, in order to continue functioning in this particular setting, how much does the government have to, or how much do we have to adapt with our current internet platforms, because things like this discussion, this dialogue right here would not be possible if we didn't have, stable internet connections. And the way that government is able to make announcements, the ones that I've primarily been seeing have been on Twitter and things of that nature, which...
Yeah, I was just going to say, and you mentioned banking, right? But what about access to information? I could only imagine there are Bermudians and people all over the world right now who are being told that they can't leave their houses. But what about those ones that don't have internet? You can't go and pick up a newspaper. You can't go and do basic things. How are people in Bermuda right now that maybe can't even watch this? How are they functioning without access to the daily press releases that are only online, banking tools that we may need? Most schools have switched to virtual learning. How are students without a computer doing right now? So I think that's definitely a valid question. Mind you, you still haven't particularly answered whether you think it needs to be a right or whether it's just a privilege that if you can afford it, you should have it. And if
She's a seasoned lawyer already.
I think, I was cautious about providing a definite answer, because I think that it's a very nuanced topic, and it's not necessarily yes or no, but as Aaron was saying, to what extent should we hold the government responsible for providing that access and making sure it's secure? Because then you get into questions about, well, what is internet access? Is it, I have Wi-Fi and I have the ability to log on to Google and a couple Bermudian websites, or is it I have this amount of broadband with, forgive me because I don't know the actual
data or whatever.
Data, I have 5G connection, I have fiber optic. Like you get into really important questions about, I guess, similar to how we'll be talking about healthcare as like, is it basic access, as in you can afford, this level of coverage and that's it? Or is it, no, we have to talk about comprehensive care as far as your internet connection so that you can access information, have, social interactions, be able to participate in dialogue such as this, to the extent that it's not, blurry and choppy and that type of thing. It's a much wider conversation that we need to have.
So it sounds like you want us to be mindful of the need for a lot of people to access the internet, but also balancing, being careful with stating that it's a right, because that would then mean having to provide people with a minimum degree of some availability of internet, right? You mentioned government a bit briefly, but you also seem to echo Stratton's sentiments about how we can turn this crisis into an opportunity. Having said that, I think that ties in quite neatly with some of our other questions, which were, what are you looking forward? What do you want us to see come out of this when this situation and crisis finally ends? How do you want it to look when we come out on the other side, in your personal views?
Personally, I really want there to be more empathy. Like you said before, I think there's an assumption from some of the older generations that because we grew up with technology, that this period is a bit easier for us to transition and adapt. And to a certain extent it is, because we are familiar with technology and different platforms. But on the other hand, as you were saying, you yourself are an outdoorsy, like, social person. And I don't think that even the most technologically integrated people would deny that social interaction is key. Like we have things like social media, but that's based off of, for the most part, the real life interactions that we have, the connections that we make in real life. And those are kind of holding together the social fabric right now. But as you said before, we need to be wary that this doesn't become the new normal indefinitely. And we don't, start to actively think about, well, how are we going to move into a place that we do have our own, food security, that we do have access to healthcare that doesn't disproportionately affect our aging population and vulnerable gene pool? How are we going to, look at our culture as a people when the busiest and most active time of the year, summer, for Bermudians, is potentially, quote unquote, canceled in a sense? how are we going to deal with that? So for me personally, I want to see more dialogue, more empathy both ways for the seniors who don't know how to cope with this unknown frontier of, well, now we have to stay at home, but how do I still operate and function in the community? But then also for the younger generations and the people who, hold graduations and travel plans and everything just, indefinitely suspended or canceled. And we don't know how we're going to move forward in the next academic year, how that's going to start, what that's going to look like. So first and foremost, empathy, I think, for everyone's situation. Secondly, forward thinking and a commitment, both from the government and from the community, to engage in meaningful discussion and planning as to, how are we going to recover from this, but also how do we start planting the seeds for that sustainable growth that Stratton was talking about, where we have our own food supply and our own reserve process, and we emit that post-hurricane Bermudian spirit of collaboration and solidarity.
You talked a bit about adaptability as well as planted seeds. And I like how you acknowledged that this is something that's affecting not only our seniors, but also our young people, perhaps in different ways, right? To a degree, we're all impacted. But I think the implications are different depending on where you come from and how, technologically integrated you are. You mentioned education. You're in the UK right now. Talk to us a bit about how things have changed out there. Why didn't you come home? Why are you still over there in the UK? Are you by yourself? Give us a little bit about your thought process around that, and as well as how you think, the UK is handling the situation.
For sure. So as far as my personal situation, I'll start there. Back, I think I want to say March 23rd or thereabouts was when the university made the decision to bring up spring break about a week early, given everything that was kind of popping off with COVID-19. And the UK had not at that point implemented any social distancing measures or lockdown procedures. It was simply the schools, or most of the universities, prematurely bringing up school spring break or closing indefinitely and sending international students home. I was fortunate in that my university did not close the library or any residences prematurely. And so for the first 2 weeks, I was safe and sheltering, and I didn't really consider it necessary to go home at that point. How the UK government has handled the COVID-19 has been tumultuous. And I think that's being generous, because the Prime Minister, I won't get into his specific comments, but it was not, I don't think the threat was taken as seriously as it probably should have been, as early as it needed to have been. And even when lockdown procedures and social distancing measures were enforced, or advised even, because they weren't enforced at first, when social distancing measures began to be recommended by the government, a lot of people here did not take them seriously. So they ended up being tightened. And then we got to the point where, you're only supposed to go out for essential work or groceries and maybe some physical activity. So I carefully weighed my options as to whether I should go home, because a lot of Bermudians at that point, including yourself, Ryan, went home and made the decision, okay, I'm going to fly back now.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the news and I was in the UK, the Prime Minister came on the press conference and he said, we're not going to work to contain the virus. We're going to allow 60 to 70% of the population to actually contract the virus, because at the time they had a strategy of herd immunity. No, I know when I saw that, I got on the first plane I could and came home, because I just knew that the Bermuda government response probably would not go down, in the same way as the UK is now. I see the UK have now reversed that position. You're still out there. How are you doing it? And tie that into, I guess, sort of what I had asked you earlier.
For sure. So, I mean, yeah, I'm still out here. There is a flight, I believe, another government chartered flight to leave, supposedly tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. And I was seriously considering getting on that flight and coming home. But after further consideration about the rest of the school year, Again, health considerations for myself, but then also because I live with two elderly grandparents, I really had to weigh the pros and cons as to, you know, being home versus being here. And the fact of the matter is I'm still very much able to function, and I'm safe in, you know, I have access to groceries, internet connection, food and supplies. And my education is online now. So I think mental health wise as well, it was just best for continuity and stability that I just try to finish out the school year here as best as possible. Now, not, you know, barring any foreseeable events, and if the government were to say reverse their position again on the pandemic, or if for some reason their curve spiked for some, you know, because people decided that they weren't going to shelter in place anymore, then I would seriously consider try to come back earlier than what I'm originally supposed to return, which is, I believe, the end of June. And I think the Bermuda government has said that the airport is projected to open again to some commercial flights by the end of June, possibly early July. So as long as that timeline, which is subject to change, as long as that timeline continues, that's kind of my plan as far as returning to the island.
Can you tell us, Ciara, if in fact that you do decide to return to the island, what your thoughts is? You recognizing that you've probably seen other jurisdictions and the quarantine facilities that have been imposed on, or mandatory quarantine that has been imposed across the globe, Raul. What do you think about the Bermuda government's decision to charge people who are coming back for their 14 days during that period? So, for example, you know, you're in the UK, you've made a decision to stay out there. So without any criticism, we've heard some people criticize it. We've seen some people say, hey, look, that's the global trend. It's nothing new. What are your thoughts?
So I have mixed thoughts about it. I recognize that while some people might be opposed to my decision to stay, there, like I said before, there were considerations as to why I did that, including the fact that traveling in and of itself puts you at risk, more so because obviously people were coming from all different parts of the UK, different backgrounds. And so, you know, taking an 8-hour flight in close proximity, that will understandably increase your risk. And then once you're back, now there's a government quarantine for 14 days. But before, you were returning straight to your home and you were going to be quarantined in place. So I think that played a huge part in my decision. You touched on how now they're charging people to be in government quarantine. And I acknowledge that was probably a tough decision for the government to make, given the fact that it wasn't the original stance. But having seen some things online and different things in the news about how people in quarantine were behaving, I kind of understand where that decision was based partially. I do think it's a little unfortunate that students who are a bit, you know, short of cash in this time are going to have to figure out a way to you know, pay that fee while they're in quarantine. But yeah, I have mixed emotions about charging people for being in quarantine.
Well, what do you think, Aaron?
Well, personally, I mean, you have to understand the decision. We don't know. We weren't in the room when they made the decision. You have to just look at the timeline, right? So you start off with the position, and this will come over the next few weeks. We'll come to analyze it. But you start off with the position that you can return. You just got to self-isolate. Yeah. So you had individuals returning during the pre-COVID-19 first confirmed case in Bermuda, where you were 14 days, they were still requesting. So they, albeit it was said in press releases and like that it's mandatory, it was simply a request that you stay at home for 14 days. And obviously people were flagrantly breaching that request. And so there became a need to impose regulations. And notwithstanding the fact that when the government imposed regulations, there still was not a fee imposed. And I do appreciate that there was some negative feedback coming, you know, some negative posts and the like that were circulated But I don't think that was representative of the whole of individuals who were staying in quarantine. I would hate to think that that was the basis of the decision. I don't think so. But I certainly think when you just analyze the notion of we're going to rescue students or Bermudians abroad, but when you get back to Bermuda, you're going to be charged. The thought of having to juxtapose your health, the risk of your health risk with your financial ability to actually pay is a very difficult thing to say that I've been saved from being stranded if I'm being put out of pocket the moment I land here in Bermuda, particularly in times where finances are going to be, extremely scarce. Your job, you may not be coming back to a summer job. That summer job that used to be available for the past 3 years, people are making cutbacks now, particularly for those Bermudians, young Bermudians who work in the tourism sector. There is not going to be a tourism season in 2020. That is the harsh reality of it. And so whilst you have to appreciate, like I said, you give the government the credit or at least the benefit of the doubt in saying that we weren't in the room. We don't know the basis of why they made that decision. But certainly from the students, from young Bermudians' perspective, I've been hit up by various young people who are abroad who are saying, well, okay, I've got a young son. Does that mean that I get charged $100 and he gets charged? Because albeit you may share a room, you're also getting 2 separate portions of food. And so those questions come into line. But again, the criticism when we saw the negative posts with respect to some individuals in quarantine was, you got a free flight back, and I don't know how true that is. You got free quarantine. And so the reality of it is there's no right answer. If the government had been giving it out for free, you'd face criticism by people saying, well, you've gotten free accommodation, money isn't printed for free. Now that they've made a decision to impose fees, and you have individuals like myself who will question the rationale on it, still there's no perfect line. You're never going to, in leadership positions, and I think that the Premier and his cabinet have a difficult position, and they're in an unenviable position of having to make decisions. We can criticize them, we can analyze them, but at the end of the day, they have to press forward and move. They've made the decision, and now it's really just questions on how we look at it, because I look at 3 budding lawyers in this chat, and we sit and analyze, not particularly those decisions have been made. We're more so looking to the future. What is fair? Is there a right? Because when you talk about things like a universal right to internet, can you have a right to internet and not have a right to accommodation, particularly in circumstances, or do you have a right to be brought back free of charge to Bermuda? Those are questions that have to be asked, because you can't say that I'm stranded. If I'm stranded, I've got no financial resources. I've got nowhere else to go, which means that the government is saying, I'm going to provide you with relief. There's a flight. But in reality, those individuals are paying for those flights.
I can only hope that there's some sort of mechanism in place. And I think that there is, where, even though they've advertised this fee of $100 a night for the 14 days, that Bermudians who don't have those funds can at least reach out and ask for assistance. Now, I struggle to wonder how that would be dealt with if every Bermudian on that flight said, I can't afford to pay, because then that would sort of negate the entire purpose, right? But at the same time, I think, unfortunately, even if the government is providing assistance to students and persons who can't pay, I'm afraid that this has already served a bit as a deterrent for persons who may be a bit destitute and want to come home, but saw that advertisement and said, okay, forget it, because I have spoken to 1 or 2 students who, when they, before this announcement was made, they were thinking about coming home, but then when they saw that, they said, oh, forget that, So even if there are provisions in place, I think not everybody will look that far into it. Now, the other thing I'm thinking about, Aaron, is, you sort of mentioned the tough decision, and it really is a tough decision, because on the other hand, I'm thinking every dollar that is given to persons coming home and going into quarantine is a dollar taken away from, for example, persons that are out of work, or seniors that are in need of social assistance or pension money. And so I genuinely think that one of the difficulties that we have to discuss as we navigate this crisis is that there simply are not enough resources to go around. How do we decide how we allocate those resources? Should we be bailing out students who are overseas and struggling to come back versus, persons who are in Bermuda and already were struggling before this? Should money be allocated towards the longer term impact? It's a tough call, but I do think it's important, just like you've brought it up, for us to discuss it. And hopefully, if there's somebody out there that is listening, if there's somebody else that's a bit confused or thinking about it, that conversations like this will at least to give a sense of groundedness as as we navigate this so that we can consider every single aspect?
Definitely. And I think that part of that analysis, and we won't be able to do it now, only in retrospect once time passes, is to know where that money is going. Because when you talk about a collective identity as a people, when you talk about us being in a global pandemic, you wonder, is there actually a need to compensate where the students are being held? Is it a need to compensate these institutions, particularly when they're not losing revenue because the revenue was never coming in the first place because they're shut down and the like? And so you've got those, considerations
as well.
You've got those considerations. So it really matters where the money is actually going, because then you've got circumstances where, for example, we've got thousands of Bermudians that have unemployment benefits and the like. And I heard you, Ryan, say that, for example, bringing stranded Bermudians back home, perhaps if it was compensated for by the government, is less, or is $1 less than could be going to, for example, unemployed Bermudians who were previously employed here. But then you look at it and you see, okay, well, the government's giving out unemployment benefits. And I think you raised it. The question is, where are those unemployment benefits going? They're going right back to the institutions that are going to benefit from this pandemic. So you're going to come
on the bank, the electric company, all of the big players that were doing all right and haven't really been affected as much as the little man on the street, And
exactly. And if you want to talk in strict legal terms, we've had this discussion, Ryan. If you talk about landlord and tenant, or if you talk about, again, your bills, the various institutions, electricity bills, and the like, these institutions that are still charging their fees, we can't actually have a balanced conversation on it unless we accept that we have to have a collective identity as a people. If not, it's purely law and business. And in business, there is no freebies. And that's what those institutions will say. Well, of course, we've got to get compensated. And if you look at our normal rate, we've actually taken a decline on our normal rate. And thus, we feel that the reduction in our normal rate is our contribution to the community. Mm-hmm. And so you've got, this very circular argument when you look at various perspectives and the like. But again, I think it's important for us to have the discussion, particularly for our generation, Ciara, is that we have to really recognize, okay, we're not going to, hopefully we don't face a COVID-19 pandemic in our future, but we're going to face serious issues. We're going to face difficulties that are going to force us to ask the question of what is the appropriate course? And now is the time to start facilitating those conversations, because whether it's COVID-19 or some other tragic event that grips the world, or even particularly is just limited to Bermuda, these fundamental questions about collective identity, what is the appropriate course of action? Who bears that responsibility? Is it community? Is it government? Those are the questions that have to be asked.
Now, Ciara, I'm also thinking, you talked a little bit about the new normal and whether we should go back to normal. And I think, Aaron, that perfectly ties in with what you were saying. We're hearing terms like shared sacrifice and unity, and, we need to consider all different angles. And I think we're going to have a serious conversation. What does shared sacrifice actually look like? What are we prioritizing during these times? Who is actually taking the hit here? So Ciara, before we finish with you, I'd just like to get your final thoughts on sort of, what the new normal should look like, if we're going to use that term, or what we should be going back to or not going back to. What particular things are you hoping to see from the Bermuda government? How do you think they have responded so far? Where do you think we may be lacking? And as we finish with you, and Aaron and I have our own discussions around the government response, what sort of things would you like us to keep in mind, and what causes should we champion on your behalf?
I'm trying to think of the first question.
I know that was a mouthful. Basically, I just want to get an idea of sort of what sort of things do you think the government and the community need to be thinking about based on our conversations today?
I think probably one of the most important things about how we move forward is leadership by example. I think that leadership is most effective when and emerging from any crisis, it's the best way to move forward from whoever is spearheading that effort is to lead by example. So if that means, if we talk about shared sacrifice, because that's a new concept for me, I haven't really reflected on what that means for Bermuda. But if we're going to talk about shared sacrifices, as a citizen, I would like to see what that looks like from the top down, and how we begin to, bring that out at all levels of our population. So when we talk about financial, health, social, education. What does that actually look like, and how do we start making those hard and tough decisions? If we're going to make cuts in certain areas of the budget, or I think we talked about earlier how the debt ceiling has actually been raised post this pandemic. But we really have to start making tough decisions and own them, from a government perspective. And even when we talk about the quarantine and how either way they were going to face criticism, I think moving forward, there's no right way to get to our, quote unquote, new normal. But we have to do that with grace and with communication, with continued dialogue. And I guess to answer your question directly, we have to start by looking at what are the things potentially that we're doing wrong right now? What's not working, and why isn't it working? Start there. Try to stop the places that for lack of a better analogy, what's bleeding the most. You know what I mean? And deal with that first, not with a Band-Aid approach, but like holistically. How can we stop the things that are really leaking from continuing to leak at that rate? And then once we have those things under control, then look at the more theoretical or abstract things that require a bit more collaboration from the community or input from different stakeholders, and say, well, how are we going to make sure that our education system is more robust to handle this, or what we consider a legitimate education? If we can adapt as a community and still say that someone's high school education is still valid if half of it is completed online, then what does that mean for the future when we try to open up again in September or January, whenever it might be, and we say, no, the legitimate way is going to school in physical classes, and this is what it has to look like. In trying times like this, you really figure out what is necessary and what is the status quo and what we desire. And so I think as we continue to navigate, especially in these next few months, where Bermuda kind of derives most of its culture, like things like May 24th and National Heroes Day, different celebrations, cut match, how are we as a people going to still maintain the essence of our culture and our hospitality and the things that kind of join us together without sacrificing the essential bits of culture that really are going to pull us through for the foreseeable future? I think that there has to be a trade-off between, there has to be some type of trade-off between the necessary sacrifices of maybe long-standing institutions that we thought were necessary, and the less necessary luxuries, for lack of a better word.
Okay. Well, Ciara, I think we've dabbled a little bit in some heated conversation and debate. So thank you for joining us. Aaron and I, we never get bored of debating, but it's always good to have somebody else on board, another intelligent young Bermudian. You're out there, you're studying law in Southampton, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, you're out there studying law, we're all navigating this together. So it was really good to have your perspectives and hear some of your views over there from the UK across the pond, as they say. You've given us some pretty good content to think about, I think so, Aaron, when it comes to the internet and other hot topics, as well as more theoretical debates. So, what is the new normal? What does it look like coming out of this crisis? So, thank you very much, Ciara. We truly value your contributions. And, we look forward to having you, engage with us when we go into Facebook Lives and do some other things to engage with the show.
Guys, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to, like I said, provide perspective. You guys always kind of have that listening ear, and you love to debate. But what I love is that you're also always willing to reach out to the community to get their perspective, to make sure that you guys stay open-minded and stimulated. And I really appreciate that, because in our generation, sometimes we can get stuck in these funnels online and only surround ourselves with people who think like us. And so I think that's important. Again, setting the example as for how we're supposed to move forward by making sure that we challenge ourselves to consider more than just our own opinions. So thank you.
You mentioned leading by example, so I hope that Aaron and I will help to do that as well.
And I'm looking, looking at this space, and as you said, when you move onto Facebook Live, watching the conversation grow, and learning myself from things that I hadn't considered as well. So thank you for having me.
No, absolutely. Thank you for coming on board. We appreciate your contribution. You definitely, Ryan and I always have this conversation, about other young people who are talented and budded, who are coming through the ranks, so to speak. And ironically, we were having a conversation and mentioning you just the other day, and just talking about other young people who are coming through the ranks. And so we look forward to, hopefully we get back to the UK one day, Ryan, one day soon, as we complete our studies, and we'll have to link up and a battle of the minds, so to speak, as we build and progress to the future.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Ciara, and have a good afternoon. So we've just hit the hour mark, Aaron, and I think we've had some pretty good conversations from our guests, but I think, it's time to turn up the heat a little bit and get some conversation about the immediate response. What you thinking?
Well, that's why I'm here, brother.
So, I mean, I don't know if you want to start. What do you think so far about, wrapping up sort of what Stratton has talked about, along with Ciara and some of the conversations we've had so far, as well as sort of, the immediate response. We've talked about some of the big topics, and some of the macro things, but we're still navigating the crisis right now, right? So while it's important to have forward thinking and progressive conversations about what this situation looks like, we still have to get through this situation first, don't we? So what are you thinking so far?
No, absolutely. I just want to take this time to thank both of the guests. They had valuable contributions that spark thoughts in my mind, that notwithstanding the conversations that you and I have going back and forth, when you hear a different perspective from other individuals, it certainly does, triggers more thoughts, particularly when Stratton was talking about the adaptability. That was one thing that we were discussing, that, for instance, your father, your grandfather, and the things that they had to go through, the times were much different. We didn't have to endure those things. And so we're a bit more of a comfortable generation. And now we really get a shift in perspective when you look at it from Ciara, who says, well, okay, well, that's not always true, because we have an ease of access to technology and the like, doesn't make this any less, of a bad time than it would be for the older generation. And so particularly when Ciara was talking about whether or not there's a balance and a particular rights for certain things, we honed in on the internet, but those are two different topics when you look at accountability and people's rights.
Yeah, and it's all subjective, right? Because struggle today, it's very different from what struggle looked like yesterday, but it's a struggle all the same, And so if we say who feels it knows it, just because I know that some people before went through harder times, be that World War II or whatever else it was, it doesn't mean that this isn't a difficult situation right now, I mean, the public mood so far as I've seen, people seem to be generally happy and satisfied with what government is doing. And I have to credit the Bermudian people, because I do think, as you said at the beginning of this show, we are a resilient people. And I think we've adapted very quickly to this. When you look at the situation, education, healthcare, things have been turned completely on their heads, right? We've seen restaurants switch to online takeout ordering in a matter of minutes, which is things that, you would know coming, back and forth between the UK. Those are things that they've had out there, certain access to certain things we've had for a while, and then we have to come back home to Bermuda, where things have still been done in an antiquated way, right? So I think for the most part, a lot of people are still keeping it calm and, have adapted rather quickly. And I think that we're in a bit of a honeymoon phase. However, I think that phase is quickly coming to an end as people start to think about the reality of this situation, right? I think government, they've been doing good so far, but they've had quite a bit of a head start and a grace period, I think, when it comes to the mood of the people. We've been very patient. We've seen people trying to keep unified and keep the support going. But I've started to see some big questions being asked, which I think that we have to start to direct our minds to. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think, as you say, the mood of the people right now is one that is, they've been exercising patience for the most part, support for the most part. And I think that a pandemic of this sort does call for that type of unity. It does call for that type of support. But as with any of those situations, there is going to come a time where you're going to have to analyze whether decisions were made, whether they were made on time, whether there was a failure on the part of any particular individual or organization. And that's what we hope to be able to get from our guests, the varying perspectives, because those perspectives will vary. For every person who supports one decision that the government has taken, there will be 5 that disagree, or vice versa. And so what we've seen thus far is generally, well, we think that, the government has done a good job. There's not much that they could have done. And I think large in part, that is because this is a global pandemic that is affecting larger governments, in more serious ways. And so this government has had the benefit of being able, for at least a time, to observe other jurisdictions and see the effect of the decisions that were or were not made in those jurisdictions and take them here. Having said that, when you really isolate it to a Bermuda perspective, we now have to ask the question, one, did we take the appropriate action in time? For instance, let's look at when we were discussing when Ciara was on about how the first provision or decision that was made was a request that if you came in during a certain period, that you self-quarantine or self-isolate at home for 14 days. There will become a question, there is a question that only will be answered in due time, whether or not that should have been made mandatory at that time to make a decision to say, hey, listen, we want to jump ahead of the curve. Let's shut everything down right now. Anybody coming down to Bermuda or coming to Bermuda is going to have to isolate at a quarantine facility. I don't know what you think, Ryan, but what would be your thoughts on actually shutting down, say, the island completely as of, let's say, March 23rd, before you have any confirmed cases? You're looking at other jurisdictions. What decision do you make? You're in the hot seat. You've got a decision to make. As we've discussed, any decision, as we've, given the premier and his cabinet the benefit of the doubt, any decision that they make will be criticized. But putting yourself in that hot position, you're on March 23rd. What decision do you make at that point in time?
Well, I mean, when you look at it, as you've said, right, this whole thing has taken the entire world by storm, right? So I think it would be fair to acknowledge that we went through a brief period as a country where we all felt like we were in over our heads a little bit. And I think there are a lot of people that still feel that right now. And the saying of the day is hindsight is 2020, right? So, I mean, we can always look back and critique and criticize. For me, the important thing is, at the time, based on the information that we had in front of us, did we make the right decision? Did we act with integrity? Did we put the needs of the people and make sure that we were concerned about the right things? And quite honestly, I mean, if you look at sort of like the World Health Organization's website and the CDC, their information is changing every day. I know there were a lot of rumors at the beginning. We were thinking about how certain people couldn't get it, or how long does this last on surfaces, or how big is this going to be? So, at the time, I would hope at least that government's decisions were guided by the experts, and I think that that's probably what's been done and what's being done. So, we can always look back and say, what could we have done differently? And I think there's a place for that. And I think that's particularly one of the things that's concerning me right now. As we've observed the press conferences and things, is I think that the public would understand if, once or twice people acknowledged, we could have done some things differently, and I think it's important to maintain public trust, So as far as I'm concerned, would I have done anything differently? I don't know, honestly, because I don't have the information that our government officials and experts had. I can only hope that they were guided by them. But moving forward, I think we all have to acknowledge we are a little bit in over our heads a bit. And I think that people would understand that, the honesty of understanding that we are in a crisis and we won't know everything and we won't get everything right. However, we will acknowledge when we need to do some work in certain areas, and at the same time, we'll remain flexible and adaptable. That's the key to handling any crisis, right? Are you worried about, or do you have any concerns in the immediate, or is there anything so far, as we continue to navigate that maybe you're a bit concerned about?
Well, I want to get back to the question really quickly. The question really was, okay, well, what would you, March 23rd, on that day, have made that decision? You can't put yourself on that day prior to not knowing the decision. Now, having recognized that individuals who did come in on flights who were requested to self-isolate when there wasn't a government quarantine, would you say that in hindsight now that is a decision that you would have made on March 23rd?
I still think that, we've had 5 deaths. And of course, we've sent our condolences to those families. When you look comparatively at a lot of other countries, I think that it's important to recognize that, we're doing okay right now. Now that could change in an instant, so I'm not going to award. And I don't think that we should be overly confident by any means. But I do think that for the most part, we're still in a state of caution. We're still in a state of calm, relatively speaking. We haven't had full out chaos. And I think that we still have been managing the situation pretty well. So would I mandatory quarantine? I think I would have listened to the experts. So that's probably what my answer would rest on. Did the experts suggest that we should quarantine and that recommendation wasn't followed? If so, then I would definitely have some more questions. For example, was it an economic consideration as to why we kept the flights open for so long and allow people to come in and not quarantine? Because in hindsight, right, the entire global economy is shut down. So that extra week or two of letting a few extra tourists come in, in hindsight, that didn't really mean a thing, did it? We might as well have just shut down. So I can only hope that we were guided by the evidence of the experts at the time and that we made the right decision. Now, the key to me, though, is moving forward. And even now, how do we ensure that we have access to the latest possible evidence, the latest possible guidance, so that the decisions that we're making now are not based on fear mongering or, speculation, but based on the best evidence that we have based on our capabilities right now?
So having said that, I take that to say, well, you will defend, or you will at least say, well, look, the government is guided by experts. And so if the experts have given a recommendation, then that's the test. If this isn't something the premier or his cabinet are not public health experts themselves. So they've got experts in place who give recommendations. The question that I have for you now, when we've had this discussion, when you look at who are those experts, who are we actually taking our advice from? We've talked about it. We've heard in some of the press conferences when they talk about Public Health England and some of the modules and the like. And I know that you had questions with respect to whether or not we're following the appropriate model and who we're actually taking our advice from. Are we looking at the English? Are we looking at the English model and following that to try to Bermudanize it, as it's been said in some of the press conferences?
Yeah, so I mean, even as we're debating right now, right, we are only debating off of the information we have in front of us as a people, right? And we can only assume that the same thing is happening for people in their homes, for people on social media. As we watch the daily press conferences, we can only make our opinions and critiques and commentaries based on the information that's being provided to us. And we can hope, but we don't know for sure, that government is making their decisions based on the evidence in front of them. So I guess one of the things that concerns me is, for example, when statements and recommendations are being made, but the information or the justifications for those decisions are not being released. So it's a delicate balance, right? We heard, for example, the chief medical officer last night in her press conference was being questioned about testing. As we know, there's a current situation and an outbreak at 2 of our rest homes. And there was some debate as to whether the right decisions were made there. And there was a need from the medical point of view to balance, the need for patient confidentiality and privacy, right? And the chief medical officer said, we're not going to give a justification for every decision we make. Now, I can understand that from a health and a scientific point of view, that, it's not for me or you as a lawyer to go picking and criticizing the doctor's recommendations, right? But from a politician's point of view, I think that it's a bit of a different story, right? So if, for example, civil servants or the experts are saying, look, we are guided by best practice, that's not necessarily the case for our leaders, and our leaders answer to us. So when somebody asks a leader a question, why did we make this decision? I think the response has to be a bit different. And that's why, even as you ask me whether the right decisions were made, I can't give an answer of yes or no, and I don't think anyone can. And I think that's why we have to focus on, are we at least acknowledging now and moving forward that we're making decisions based on what's in front of us? So, particularly with the modeling, I know that there's been some mentioning that, the models have been done by Public Health England, or the data has been collected in Bermuda and they're being Bermudianized in the UK. My concern around that is that we're still waiting on those models. So the general public can't really comment as to whether the government is making the right decisions, because we only have to trust that the information they have right now is accurate, right? Now, that's concerning in light of the fact that we've heard statements released already that, if we do this or we do that, we'll have, at worst case scenario, 700 deaths, for example, or in a better case scenario, 280 deaths, or whatever the exact numbers were. But then when we ask questions about well, can we see those models? We're getting answers like, well, they're not finalized. So I think there were some ethical considerations there as to releasing information that isn't completely accurate or finalized, because it then leads questions as to trust from the people as to whether we're listening to the right experts. I don't know if you have any opinion on what that might be, but for me right now, I would say that that's something that I think I'd like to see a little bit more. Either, make decisions based on evidence and show us evidence insofar as you can, or, don't make statements like we're going to have this many deaths or whatever, which, effectively put fear into the people without any sort of, statements or evidence to justify that.
No, and that's fair. I think that what essentially you're saying is that the government have information in front of them that we don't have as a community. And so for that reason, it would be inappropriate or premature to render a conclusive whether or not judgment on those decisions, not having that information that they have in front of them. I think that leads us to a larger question of what right do the public have to that information from a legal perspective. Even when you look at the laws that are being passed, much of the public is going to be relying on the news, relying on daily press conferences to depend on, okay, well, what's the state of the law today? For example, there was a declaration made that, well, until the 30th of June, there's going to be a state of emergency. And then there's been further talk about, well, we're going to create our own legislation so that there's not a need for that. Well, when we talk about tying it back into Ciara's point earlier about the right to internet, how does somebody who is confined to their home find out about the updates to the law and the provisions that are being made if I don't have access to internet? And those are things that we have to look at. That's not a criticism of the government today, because we've never been in a position like this before. We've got to ask ourselves, what is appropriate in the circumstance? What are the disclosures that are going to be made to allow the law? Because to what extent can you be held responsible for a law if the government who imposes, or parliament who imposes that law, hasn't given you the opportunity to let you know, hey, look, this is the law that's being changed. We've seen, for example, we've got e-gazette notices and legal notices online now. But again, that's only great if you have internet. And when you look at a large part of the community now, thousands of members of the community who are unemployed, perhaps they could afford internet before, but maybe that's one of the expenses that they're not going to spend their $500 maximum that the government is going to give them. And so there's all sorts of questions that are raised there. And even when you look at whether or not the right decisions are being made, particularly I think that when the government references that you've got experts that you're relying on, I think the public deserves to know who those experts are. We've got models that we're relying on. We need to know what those models are. And this is not a culture of debate or criticism. I think that the government shouldn't, one, be fearful of criticism. They shouldn't be fearful of questions, because that's what, as we've just discovered, having two guests on board, that when we have perspectives, we may have a solidified view in our mind. When you hear somebody else's perspective, and when you're talking about experts, these experts are coming with factual knowledge. And so it's important from a perspective of when considering that the constitutional rights are being suspended, and you look at an equality on the parliamentary level of balance, now more than ever before, should we be looking to the opposition to make sure that there's a balance holding the government accountable?
And I'm glad you said that, because you touched on a few important points there, right? So I just want to interject there to reiterate them. Firstly, in response to the government response, I do have to credit them when it comes to, for example, things like access to internet and the laws. We've seen that our homeless population have been housed at Berkeley Institute and then later on Cedar Bridge. So it's good to know that at least some of the people who were before out on the streets and would not be aware of certain things that are happening in the political space now at least have a central location where they can meet and get information. And I hope that that's something that continues after this crisis ends. Now, the bigger point that you touched on was the need for access to, awareness around constitutional rights and things like that. You mentioned that the state of emergency has been extended. And you said that now more than ever, there's a need for things like the opposition and other checks and balances, because that's what I see it as a check and balance, right? And so that ties in, we have to keep in mind here, because I've seen some comments on social media at the regular press conferences criticizing some of the journalists. And I take a serious issue with that. I think that our journalists, the ones that have been attending the press conferences, they're doing the best that they can. But at the same time, we as the members of the public have to hold the pressure on the government, because we have to recognize we're in a state of emergency. Constitutional rights have been suspended. We're all locked in our houses. The only access we do have to accountability right now is through press conferences that are being held on social media, and the questions that get asked at those conferences. So, on that note, I want to ask Aaron, what do you think about the fact that, press conference questions have been limited to 4? Before we had 5 press conferences a week, and the press were originally answering and asking many questions, right? And the government at the time said, we'll stay as long as we need to answer however many questions you have. But now we've been reduced to a section where questions are limited to 4 questions per journalist. Some of the journalists last night complained that they've emailed questions and haven't been getting responses. Do you think, what's the balance there? Because obviously government is managing a lot right now. What do you think?
Well, I think in any situation where you're suspending constitutional rights, where people's access to information is restricted, you've got to go over and beyond. The state, the government has a duty to go over and beyond to accommodate that transparency, so that access to that information. And as you say, right now, the only access that we have, the only avenue or vehicle that we have are the press and their questions. Having said that, however, there is a balancing act, because you cannot go and ask an unlimited number of questions. And so there's a balancing act, because I say you disagree with 4, but what's 5? Is 5 appropriate, or is 6 appropriate? No matter where you draw that line, there's going to be a question. But I do think that, as you say, there needs to be an important guideline, I think, of this is the position, because you can't necessarily criticize, because I think the government said 4 questions on one evening, and then the following evening it was opened up for other questions. Mm-hmm. So there has to be a position. When you take a position, but in a position of leadership, make the decision. You're going to be criticized for it by some people. Make the decision, stand by it. But I don't think that we're able to actually properly gauge whether or not they have made the appropriate decision by saying 4, because I don't think that they're actually really adhering to that, notwithstanding that they've said it.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, at the same time, I'm just thinking about the fact, we the public, right? We have a lot of questions, and I know the Premier did a live stream answering some questions, which I think was really good, right? But at the same time, journalists have particular access to inside information from the general public. They collate and collect data and information and news tips. And sometimes you have to ask more than a couple questions, and sometimes you have to go back and forth, right? So, let's say there's a particular topic that comes up, or a particular issue that I'm aware of, and I have to question you, Aaron, who's a politician. I may ask my first initial question, and you may, dodge that question. You may give me a runaround answer, and I now need to ask a follow-up question, and then another question. That's not going to happen when somebody's coming online and saying, you're only allowed to have 4 questions. So, I mean, there's 2 takeaways there. Like, one is that we have to find a way to be able to at least hold our leaders accountable without just asking yes or no questions. But at the same time, we have to find a way to go beyond that one press conference and examine an issue further, right?
There's as you say, there's 2 sides to it. There's one side in saying that the government has a responsibility to allow access, and then there's a responsibility on the journalists themselves. No, they're not advocates. No, they're not trained lawyers to ask pointed questions, and I don't think that we can expect that of them. Having said that, however, there is a responsibility that you are going to get to the point that you want to get an answer, and you got to find a way. So I think, by putting
questions in it, maybe some of these journalists should be consulting their legal teams or something on how to, because a lot of our politicians are lawyers, right? You're going to get an answer the way that a lawyer would answer the question. So that's a valid point. There is a responsibility for our media and our journalists to ask proper and valid questions, because you're asking not just for yourself, but for the wider public. And I think on the government side, if you don't have the time to sit around and answer questions, but journalists are complaining that their emails aren't getting answered, then that's concerning to me in a state of emergency when it comes to our constitutional rights, the ability to debate and have, free and open discussions and conversations. So maybe government should consider, if they can all make a press conference and stay forever, get a press secretary, get somebody there who can at least allay the concerns of the people and the journalists. I don't know. Maybe what do you think?
Well, like I said, there's no number that you can put on it, because I think that you have to allow journalists that leeway. But I disagree with 4, but if you say 6, is that enough? It's going to be subjective to the point. And I think that the ultimate judge is really going to be the voters of this country, the Bermudian people, because whether or not I ask you one question or I ask you 10 questions, if you, as the politician, as the elected member of parliament, as an elected member of government, as a minister, know exactly what I'm asking you, and you make a determined and concerted effort to avoid what I'm asking you, or to tell me something that was totally left field from the question that was posed, then fair enough. Maybe I, as an unexperienced or untrained journalist in respect of asking pointed questions, can actually sit there and say, okay, well, maybe I didn't get the answer I wanted.
Yeah, I tried.
But sitting back at home for you and I and the rest of the community who's sitting back and watching, all right, cool, noted. Because at the end of the day, it's not the journalist. It's not an ego battle between the person who asks questions and the person asking questions. The person asking questions stands to benefit us. And also they have a duty to ask questions, but also the politicians and the elected members of parliament have a duty to disclose the information. And whether or not they want to exploit a loophole, a technicality that the question you asked me wasn't phrased in the right way, then that's a matter for them. And that's what we're going to have to consider at a later date.
Yeah.
But having said that, I think that, we're warming up here. I think that over the coming weeks, Tuesdays and Thursdays, we're going to have heated conversations like this. We're going to have examples. And I think it's perfect, actually, that the government have reduced their press conferences to Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I say perfect in the same breath that I'm saying that they should be transparent and disclosing information. But certainly ideal for our programming. Because what it's going to allow us to do is that tomorrow we're going to see a press conference. On Monday, we'll see another press conference. And then Tuesday, we'll be right back here. But I think that it's appropriate time for us to kind of wrap up and give individuals a idea of what to expect over the coming weeks. Having said that, I'll hand it over.
I mean, on a final note, right, I think it's almost poetic that we ended talking about journalism and the duty to share public information and the duty of politicians to be open and transparent with us, right? Because that's exactly what this platform and others like it are for, right? We have started this conversation hosted by Bernews graciously in order to bring to the public some more critical conversation, right? It's necessary. We are in unprecedented times, as we've stated. The last time we've been in a state of emergency was in the 70s when we had the Bermuda riots, and that was a completely different threat, And so we can't allow ourselves to, even though we're shut in our homes, to close our minds, to sit back and reduce ourselves to just listening to prompted questions and answers between government and journalists. There has to be some sort of conversation to provide not only a check and balance on government, but also a check and balance on the Bermudian people, because as we've stated, we are in a honeymoon phase right now. We all have to get through this together. But, as somebody stated, I think it was MP Scott Pierman who mentioned, he did a column or said something publicly that solidarity does not require our silence, right? And I think a big part of this conversation and having this crisis being navigated is for us to check each other, just as you and I have done, have our debates, go back and forth, analyze the information in front of us, and make sure that we're all keeping each other in check. And so with that being said, for the future shows, we like to talk about a variety of different topics, and it's not just always going to be talking about government and their response, but what are we as a people doing? What are we as a community doing? We have the third sector crisis relief efforts. We have charities that have stepped up to help support our most vulnerable. We have, international businesses and companies that have stepped forward in some ways to donate. We have questions based on what Ciara and Stratton have asked. What is that duty, right? Are companies doing enough? Are organizations doing enough to support the community? Do we need to take bolder steps? And these are all the types of things that we like to examine in the coming weeks. But, we're approaching the half-hour mark. I think we've covered a lot today. I'm looking forward to seeing what the Bermudian public have to say about our conversation today and Stratton's comments on resilience and food security and sustainability, and Ciara's questions about, the duty of providing internet. What is the future holding for us? Is this the new normal? So, we've had a very great show today, and I'm looking forward to a lot more conversations, especially with input from the public.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Ryan. It's been a pleasure. I know we'll have
likewise.
Conversations in the future that will both be stimulating, not just for ourselves and our growth, but for the community. And so I'm grateful for that. Again, thanks to our guests. Again, thank you to Bernews. I'd just like to give this mention out to members of the public. If there are any specific topics that you'd like to see us cover over the coming weeks, if there's anybody that you'd like to see us have on our program, again, this is another avenue for us to allow some sort of transparency to facilitate discussion within the community in times where it's restricted. And so if you have any feedback for us, any things we ought to consider, then feel free to reach out. I know that we had on the bottom of the screen the email address, so shoot us a message and we'll be sure to cover it over the coming weeks. But thank you again for tuning in. This is Aaron Hill, Ryan Robinson, Perinchief, and this is the Bernews special COVID-19 series.
And to steal a line from Ciara, you know, leading by example, we hope to do the same. So criticize us, comment with us. We look forward to hearing your thoughts, and we commit in the next coming weeks to, you know, contribute to this conversation. Thanks again to all our essential workers, and we send our condolences to those affected and our sympathies to those affected directly by the COVID-19 crisis. We look forward to future conversations as we all navigate this together. So thanks, Aaron. This is Ryan speaking, and we'll see you on Tuesday.
All right.